Good morning. I hope that you are able to join, and all of us, we're not experiencing technical difficulties. We'll just wait a couple of more minutes so everybody can feel comfortable, have their headphones on and their cup of tea so we can enjoy our meeting together. Thank you for making the time. Just wait a couple of minutes. Thank you.
So while we're waiting, I'll just read out some of the technical information. This webinar will be recorded and made available on EASPD social media channels following the event. Your microphone, if you're attending as a participant, is muted to ensure the quality of the session. But if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the Q&A box. And if you want to make any more general comments, say hello to everybody else, please use the chat box. We also have closed captioning for this webinar. You can activate them by clicking the live transcript button on the lower part of your screen on the Zoom panel. You can then move these subtitles around wherever you want by clicking on the box and dragging them to where you'd like them to be.
Thank you very much, Rachel. The technical information is, I think, becoming more and more needed with each webinar. I think in the beginning of the pandemic, we were hoping it will be vice versa. Zoom will grow on us, but I think with each webinar, technical difficulties are becoming more and more common. So thank you for the update. I think that we are becoming more and more participants. So as we have registered a bit over 50, we'll just wait a couple of more minutes. So whoever signed in can as well be here. Okay, I think that we can slowly start. As you know, in a proper face-to-face meeting, there is this 10 minutes of chatting and waiting and giggling and speaking about the weather. But in an online Zoom meeting, people tend to be a bit more aware of the time. And if somebody's late, they generally are late with a couple of minutes, and we assume they're already here. So I would like to start first with thanking you that you're all here and you make the time for our meeting today. I'm sure that this year has been quite exhausting for all of the professionals working within the social sector and within the inclusive education field. And especially with the last developments all over Europe, with the pressure within the educational and the social and the health system, I would just like to really start by saying thank you for making the time and for having the energy for another webinar, for another event on sharing our ideas, and for another event dedicated to how to actually shape the system so it's a bit more inclusive and a bit more welcoming, so it can support all learning needs for all learning people. What I would like to start with is a bit of an overview of why we are here today and what's the point of our meeting. As you know, we are membership-driven organization. So based on the expertise that we have within our members, EASPD started a while ago to work on the topic of inclusive education. In 2012, we had our manifesto on inclusive learning, which was followed then 3 years after with the 2015 Lisbon Declaration towards more inclusive learning. All of those steps are the signs that we as a network, even though we are not working directly with schools and that we are not uniting educational institutions, we very clearly see the gaps that educational system have regarding inclusive education. The documents that we have laid are the foundation of the policy making that we do, the recommendations that we try to recommend towards the different stakeholders on European, on local and national level together with our members. This work, of course, includes implementation of number of European projects, number of meetings, some of them online, some of them offline. And I'm actually glad to say that very, very long time ago, my first EASPD event that I ever attended was with Miguel. I'm not sure if he remembers. It was in Brussels, yes. 4 or 5 years ago. I remember that these events, in a way, as a networker and somebody who used to work in a social organization on a grassroots level, these events were very crucial for me. The exchange, the network, the power of knowing that other people are facing and battling similar challenges as you is actually very, very supportive and very inspiring. So the policy making that we have with all of those big documents, in a way, is put in different pieces, in different projects, in different meetings. And what we're really trying to do at the end of the day is have all of those puzzle pieces in a common understanding towards different stakeholders. So today is just another puzzle piece of that whole puzzle. What exactly we will do today? We will have in a bit the floor towards Rachel from our team. She will present to us the declaration, the last really interesting and well-written document we have towards the topic of inclusive education. And then we'll have a roundtable with really interesting professionals from the field to share a bit of their experience and, of course, to challenge each other's views and see what can be done in this really interesting, let's put it like that, and difficult times that we live in. Even before the start of this exact webinar, we were discussing with the speakers that again, Europe is going towards closing of the schools. Again, we are going to the measure which is everything else but inclusive, especially towards students with special educational needs. And I think that all of the efforts that we have done so far really needs to be adopted on a larger level by all of the stakeholders, so we have nobody left behind when it comes to learning, because learning is also the gate to the community. It's not only learning math or learning science or having the physical education. Yeah, of course, these are the tools of somebody being in school, but at the end of the day, this process is an indicator of being in the community. So this is what we're here for today. Thank you very much again for being here. Rachel, I would like to give the floor now to you so you can share with us a bit more about the declaration. Thank you very
much. And thank you very much, everybody, for joining us for this webinar, as Maya said, to look at our new declaration and also explore together some of the key themes and challenges that we're seeing in inclusive education today. So I wanted to start with the why of inclusive education. Why are we here? Why are we working towards inclusive education? As we all know, we have various legal and human rights documents and instruments which assert the right of all learners, including those with disabilities, to a high quality, inclusive education alongside their peers. One of the most important instruments for EASPD and our members is the Uncrpd, which guides our work and that of our members. And with the ratification of the United Nations Convention by all EU member states, these countries are obliged to create inclusive education systems which uphold the rights of learners with disabilities. But I would say more widely and importantly, inclusive education isn't just for learners with support needs. It benefits all learners, and inclusive education is about creating systems that better embrace the diverse needs and talents of learners, and they're flexible enough to empower all learners, regardless of their support needs, to develop fully and reach their fullest potential. So we have this obligation and this need for inclusive education, and we see it as very beneficial to not only learners with disabilities, but all learners, including ourselves. We all learn differently, but we see that we're not there yet. We're, as countries, we are all on different paths towards inclusion, and we have different challenges. But through EASPD and our work, and the work of our partners, we do see some common challenges to achieving inclusive education. So a first one is misconceptions and negative attitudes towards disability and inclusion. That can sometimes come from fear, or maybe a lack of education. And we also see a prevalence of the medicalised model of disability. So that puts the problem on the learners rather than the system and society around them. We also see a lack of political drive for change, which can make our work a lot harder when we try and encourage policymakers to implement policies that can support inclusive education. And there's another reason for our Lisbon Declaration. We can still see the continued segregation of education systems or special schools as a big challenge. And it can often mean that the resources are channeled towards special schools rather than supporting mainstream schools to be more inclusive. We see in some schools that still physical inaccessibility can be a problem. The appropriate teacher training and access to resources isn't always there. And I think around this issue, there can be, it can sometimes seem overwhelming, and teachers and schools feel like they need a lot of resources. We recently got back from a training course in Kosovo, and we were looking at universal design for learning. And sometimes it can be believed that you need lots of resources and technology to be able to provide universal learning environments. But actually, with the right training and with a small amount of resources, you can do a lot in creating more flexible learning environments, and also more sort of, flexible curricula and assessments. We also see that professionals quite often work independently. You need lots of people working around a learner. You have their families, them themselves, teachers, different professionals, therapists, and often they will work independently, and we don't find people coming together to work towards a common goal. And so support service providers can be key for this, for coming together and helping people to work together and provide support, which is another barrier that we see, in that these stakeholders lack the support they need to be able to make the transition to inclusive education. And we also see a lack of data collection. And this comes at European and national levels, which means we can't monitor the progress towards inclusive education, and we can't see if we're heading in the right direction. So this is sort of the first backdrop to EASPD's work on inclusive education, and the work of our member foreign education, who've been driving the development of this latest declaration. Of course, we have had more recently in 2020, the COVID pandemic, and EASPD has collected some data via our recent barometer reports that's found in many of the countries surveyed, inclusive education has maybe halted or gone backwards, with children with disabilities being forced to stay at home, along with all other children. But often we found that children with disabilities have been the first to leave the classroom and the last to go back. And we hear of a worrying learning delay around all students, but again, specifically for students with disabilities who maybe need extra support to be able to catch up. However, despite that maybe negative impact of the COVID pandemic, and hopefully we'll hear more about that in our next panel, it has also brought some opportunities, and it's allowed people to explore new ways of learning, new methodologies, and for example, the recent council recommendation on blended learning environments is a result of the pandemic and may not have come without it. So speaking of the opportunities of the pandemic, we've also seen a rapid acceleration of the uptake of technology, both by students and schools and teachers. Again, it's sort of a double-edged sword. There have been some positives, and they can bring new opportunities if used in the right way. And again, hopefully we'll speak about that in the next panel. But there's also some challenges that we need to be aware of. This technology has to be accessible, and we need to ensure that everybody has the training to be able to use it, but also is able to access it, has access to the technology and also the software, such as a Wi-Fi connection and things like that, to make sure that this technology can be used by everybody and it can promote inclusion rather than exclusion. So, as I've said, this is sort of the context to our Lisbon Declaration that we've developed. As Maya said, it's been developed on the previous work of EASPD and other policy recommendations that we've done. And also more recently, our conference in May, that's titled in the same name, where we asked different stakeholders and the participants of our conference to give us feedback on what their recommendations are to support the realization of inclusive education. So hopefully you can see your feedback in the recommendations. These recommendations are targeted at European policymakers, national policymakers, teachers, schools, support service providers, and also have some commitments at EASPD. I hope that you can join us in supporting these recommendations and sharing them with your stakeholders. And we'll discuss the recommendations in a little more detail later. And I hope that you take the time to read the document. It will be sent to you after this webinar. And moving forward, I just want to touch on a few key themes that we have focused on in the declaration. So the first of this is working together for an inclusive community in the school. We believe it's really important to see the school as an integral part of the community, and schools should see themselves as part of an inclusive system. So we encourage policymakers at a national level to shift from institutional structures into community-based systems and considering the life cycle of the individual. When we're looking at inclusive education, we also have to think of early intervention before they go into school, and then also their transition into the labour market. So we encourage national policymakers to think of this, and also to look at sort of the post-secondary school sector or education sector. We quite often, when we talk of inclusive education, we think of primary and secondary school, but we also have higher education, vocational education and training, and that's all very important for ensuring the continued inclusion of learners in their communities and giving them opportunities to join the labour markets. We also encourage policymakers to strengthen awareness in the local community for the importance of inclusive education and its benefits. Looking to teachers and trainers and schools, we encourage them to collaborate with the family and the wider community, and also encourage this in children with peer-to-peer learning. And here we see again, support service providers are crucial in this. They should be working with different stakeholders, schools, learners, families, to connect everybody and support the delivery of community-based support and include children in mainstream schools. More recently, through the Erasmus Plus Beyond project, EASPD and a number of partners from our member Foreign Education have been looking more into the role that service providers can play in inclusive education, and this is sort of a key role in sort of acting as a bridge and bringing together stakeholders to work together for an inclusive school and also for the community. Another theme that we've wanted to focus on is flexible curricular assessment and learning styles. So our current system can be inflexible, and it requires learners to learn and demonstrate their knowledge in very traditional methods, such as an academic test. And this doesn't always enable students to demonstrate their progress and their talents to the fullest. So we again encourage national policymakers to promote the implementation of universal design in all learning environments, and consider refining or redefining school achievements and assessment methods so that it's more flexible. Very important in this is the reform of teacher education systems to enable teachers and staff to understand how they can use instruments or methodologies such as universal design and implement more flexible assessments so that they're more confident in the work that they're doing and they can better implement that. When it comes to professionals and teachers, we encourage them and recommend them to implement universal design in their learning environments, both for the learning and also for the physical accessibility, and to transfer good practices among themselves and adapt their evaluation methods to be more flexible and to recognise the individual talents of students. Service providers, again, are important here. They can facilitate that exchange for information, support the knowledge sharing process, and share their own knowledge. A third theme that we will again touch on in the panel later is ensuring that schools are ready for the digital transition. Here, we encourage national policymakers to ensure that education providers and social services, learners and their parents as well can fully access and understand how to use the technology and have access to the software and the infrastructure such as internet and things like that. Again, here, teacher training is really important, and we encourage teachers to utilize online platform applications that are accessible to them and use resources that are available to them. EASPD is currently involved in a project, the Include project, which is developing an online repository of digital schools that can be used by lecturers and higher educational students to make their lectures and their learning content more inclusive, or can be used by learners to better access material that might have otherwise been inaccessible for them. We also have UNICEF have just launched an online digital education platform that's been developed with the support of David Baines, a partner of the EASPD. So there are plenty of tools out there that could be used by teachers. Again, close collaboration between support service providers and other stakeholders is needed to support these tools. And it means working closely with families and their learners. So finally, just to touch on the role of the EU, we know that education is a competence of member states, but there is still a role of the European Union in supporting more inclusive education. And we have a number of recommendations. So firstly, to promote clear and coherent policy frameworks. With their work with the new disability platform, we recommend that they have a specific focus on inclusive education. Coming back to data collection, we recommend that they explore how we can better collect data on inclusive education, potentially through the European semester process. They should also lead the way. The European Commission has their own schools, European schools, and we recommend that they desegregate these schools and become more inclusive. Promote a harmonized definition of disability in Europe based on the Uncrpd, which again will help us to better monitor the state of inclusive education in different European countries. Promote the recommendations of the European Agency for Special Needs and Inclusive Education. And also something that they do a lot, and we encourage them to continue to do, is contribute to the achievement of inclusive education via the EU funding programs, particularly Erasmus+, we have FC+, sort of the regional development funds, and also Invest EU. So thank you very much for listening. That was a very quick tour of our recommendations. As I said, that's sort of brushing the surface. I hope you take the time to read them in your own time. And we'll also explore them a little deeper now with our panelists. So I'll hand over to Annemie.
Thank you very much, Rachel, for this nice introduction of the new Lisbon Declaration on Inclusive Education. It's a very important document. You can find it online. It is also a very nice layout. So it's really a working document for your own practice, for your own country, for your own work situation. I would like to welcome the panelists of today. Welcome to Marta Markowska from the Digital Education Unit from the European Commission. Welcome to Gerald Graddock from the Center for Excellence of Universal Design. Welcome to Helen Portal from Inclusion Europe. and welcome to Archer Krauchenberg from the European Parents Association. You have all prepared a small PowerPoint presentation or a talk to reflect on this Lisbon Declaration. You have all 10 minutes time to give your reflection on the declaration. So I would like to start with Marta Markowska, who will speak on the European Commission's Digital Education Action Plan and its inclusive dimension. Marta, please, the floor is yours.
Excellent. Thank you very much for inviting me today. I think this discussion is very timely, not only in terms of what we have learned throughout the pandemic and the ongoing crisis as relates to inclusive education, but also what it means to digital education and going forward, what can we as policymakers, as practitioners, as teachers, as educators take forward. So thank you very much. I think this is incredibly relevant. I am going to now share my screen. Here we go. Let me just do a full screen. Can you see that okay?
It's just loading.
Yes.
It's paused apparently. Your screen sharing is paused. I wonder why that is.
Have you got a different application open at the same time?
No, let me resume share. Does that work now?
Yeah, okay. It's not in presentation mode, so if you try it again now.
When I did the tech check, it worked.
Yeah, it worked perfectly first time.
Hold on.
Can you just present now? Can you press the present button?
It says I'm screen sharing, so that should work. Present online, it won't let me do that. From
Try
current.
just from the beginning. You don't need to present online, just from the current slide.
Yeah, this is the current slide I have.
Okay, and what we can see now is your PowerPoint through Word. It's not yet in presenting mode. It's not in full screen.
Hold on. Yeah, it's.
If you go to the top, there's a small icon of like a screen with a play button, very top.
Yes, I clicked on that and nothing happened with that.
Okay. If you're on the home.
Okay, let me, I'm gonna stop this again. Hold on. Apologies for this, but we checked this a second ago and it worked perfectly well. Okay, now let's try that.
Yeah, perfect.
You can see it?
Yeah, it's all good.
It's perfect.
Right, but for some reason I'm unable to see it. Hold on. Does it work now?
You can see it, yes. It's also moving.
Yeah.
You can see it. Perfect. Excellent. Great. So before I get into the specifics of the Digital Education Action Plan, I want to speak a little bit about essentially, the bigger dimension in terms of digital education and inclusion. We know essentially that the ongoing COVID crisis has really exposed I would say, our education and our training systems to really unprecedented challenges, especially regarding, I would say, the quality of the educational offer and really underlying the need for everyone to have equal access to it. And we often say that, a European Union truly prepared for the digital age needs, educational and training systems that are in equal measure, I would say, equipped to address the opportunities and really the challenges that come from the digital transformation. And the goal is always high quality digital education that is accessible, inclusive, and available to all. We also know that it's essentially of utmost importance to put in measures, policy reforms, I would say, that strengthen the digital capacity of EU and education systems. Now, we often talk about connectivity and infrastructure, and that is key, obviously, because we cannot talk about digital education if we don't have internet connections and devices in classrooms. But it's really about boosting, I would say, also the learners and teachers' digital competences, promoting innovative practices and using digital technologies to enhance teaching and learning. And this is really everything from physical face-to-face learning, distance learning, hybrid learning, the broader spectrum. And here we always come down to the notion that it's the importance of leaving no learner behind. Now, it's always good to look at the numbers a little bit, just to give us a bit of a bigger picture and orient ourselves a little on the digital side. So we always say, you know, future jobs will require digital skills. The future is now. You know, we're trying to prepare students and learners for jobs that don't exist. But if we look at this in terms of what the numbers say, you know, 90% of jobs will require some sort of digital skills, yet we know that around a third of Europeans currently lack these skills. If we look at our young people, so not only European citizens, but young people, about a fifth of them lack basic digital skills, and those numbers are even more profound if we look at learners from lower educational levels that are three times really as likely to underachieve in these digital skills. Equally important, if we look at sort of the shift to distance and online learning during the pandemic and what this meant for learners at home, you know, almost 10% of them didn't have a quiet home, a quiet place to study within the home. So if we look at sort of measures to promote a good quality of learning, you know, we look at also what happens outside of the classroom. In terms of, you know, young people that are not in education, employment, or training, you know, young people with disabilities are twice as likely, essentially. And lastly, fewer than 10% of individuals with disabilities have participated in some type of lifelong learning compared to 21% without disabilities. So if we look at those numbers in sort of in the bigger perspective, I think it paints a picture of, you know, where we are and slightly, you know, what we need to do, you know, where we want to get, essentially. Now, so if we look at promoting inclusive education and we sort of start from the bigger picture, we always remind ourselves, obviously, of what we have in place. And we look at the first pillar of European social rights, which clearly articulates, just going to read this, that everyone has the right to quality and inclusive education, training, and lifelong learning in order to maintain and acquire skills that enable them to fully participate in society and manage successful transitions into the labor market. So we're really looking at the lifelong learning approach. Once again, equality, access, and ensuring that that no one is left behind. Now, if we translate this basic principle into what this means for digital education and what needs to be done to provide a high quality digital education, I think there's several truths that sort of come to light. We always talk about access to digital infrastructure and high quality tools. This is important, obviously, but, you know, access, you know, is not a guarantor necessarily of learning outcomes. We also need to look at well-trained and dedicated, passionate teachers that have the ICT competences. We need to look at pedagogical practices. How do we incorporate the smart use of tech in classrooms? Also, vision-led education institutions where there's a strategy in place, essentially, to implement high-quality digital education. And likewise, we also look at the potential of digital tools and what this means for learners with different learning needs. So whether it's learners with disabilities, special education needs, learners from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, the rural-urban divide, which we sometimes often sort of forget in our narrative, the use of assistive and adaptive technologies, whether it's AR tools, gamification, audio tools, supporting writing tools. There's different mechanisms in place, and, you know, to assist our learners with their needs. And there needs to be a sort of strategic approach looking at digital pedagogy and also the best way to incorporate these tools into learning. So that in effect, it can improve the learning outcomes of students and give them more agency over learning. But we know, just the last point on my slide, that, you know, digital technologies, just putting more tech into classrooms, I mean, this isn't sort of the magic solution. It has to be used effectively. It has to be well integrated. There needs to be a vision for it so that it essentially complements, allows for personalized, tailored learning that looks at really the learning needs of all learners. Now, before I get into the Digital Education Action Plan that was adopted in 2020, we ran an open public consultation, which brought to light a lot of sort of key lessons and insights. We had over 2,700 respondents from about 60 countries. And here, you know, there was so much food for thought in terms of, you know, not only the degree to which it was a real turning point for the use of technology for around, I think, 90% of respondents, but some of the challenges that were revealed in terms of bringing to light further the socioeconomic inequalities, the infrastructure issues, issues related to connectivity, the need for teachers for more guidance, the lack of high quality online learning content. So I think this really put a spotlight in many ways on where the focus has to be, which in effect really, which really sort of provided real input and a real orientation for the digital education plan, which we then adopted. So our response, in effect, was the digital education plan, and it's really our vision, our roadmap for providing inclusive, high-quality digital education across Europe from the 2021 to 2027 period. And I would say it builds on the previous action plan, which was the first action plan, 2018 to 2020. Perhaps building on some of the lessons learned. So in terms of how does the action plan build on what was revealed in terms of delivering on its promises? So really see that high quality and inclusive education needs to be a strategic horizontal priority across what we do in education and training. And for this, we need to work together. So there was mention already of bringing in the community, the whole school approach, the importance of working with families, with civil society. So it's really, it really does take a village, and we are looking at education sort of not just formally within classrooms, the role of key players, once again, the larger society approach, the private sector as well, the work that we are doing with the EdTech sector to see how we can sort of boost innovation, digital education, technology in the learning environment. And the need really for stronger, I would say, cross-sectoral collaboration across many areas. Within the, well, actually, just maybe a little bit on the investment side, the Recovery and Resilience Facility. So this is one of the main funding instruments that we have, and this was as a I would say reaction to the pandemic. Member states have submitted their plans in terms of how they would like to target their investments, how they would like to target their reforms. And specifically here, just a snapshot of member states' plans when it comes to digital education. And here we see that there's a real appetite for several areas that have come to light: digital infrastructure, equipment, digital skills of the adult population, teacher training that we see coming up as a continuous theme, digital education platforms where learners, teachers, educators can share content, can exchange. So there's been a real need for this. And these plans are still being finalized in terms of what the final numbers will be on the budget side. Now, in terms of the actual action plan, there are two key priorities that we have. One is really on fostering the development of a high-performing digital education system. And the best way to think of that is sort of all the building blocks, what needs to go into education and training if we look at the digital side. So everything from content, from infrastructure to connectivity to well-trained teachers. And within this, we have several actions that we will deliver on, are in the process of implementing. I will go through these in more detail when we look at the inclusion angle more specifically. But everything from a recommendation on online and distance learning for primary and secondary education that the Commission adopted before the summer, to looking at European exchange platform, to looking at the smart use of digital pedagogy, ethical guidelines on the use of AI, to enhancing digital skills and competences for the digital transformation. This is the second strategic priority. And this really looks at how can we strengthen the skills and competences of our learners so that they can thrive in the digital transformation, to ensure that also on the other side that our education and training systems can really keep up with the pace of change. And here we have several actions that we are rolling out. For example, guidelines for teachers on how to tackle disinformation, promote digital literacy, European Digital Skills Certificate in view of having a certificate that would be recognized as by employers across Europe on the digital skills that have been acquired by citizens. A competence benchmark to ensure that we are even more ambitious when it comes to the competence levels of our learners, as well as looking at really the participation of women in STEM. I should always also add that bringing a lot of this together is the European Digital Education Hub, which we will be launching early next year. This will be an online community bringing together European digital education practitioners, policymakers, researchers, civil society, academics, a sort of one place to look at innovation in digital education, look at what needs to be done, and provide a real active voice for the different sectors, working across sectors in Europe. So this will be launched in the next year, and it's something that we are very much looking forward to. Just 2 more slides. If we look at briefly, maybe once again through the inclusion angle, to zoom in just on a couple, but a half a dozen or so actions. So the action plan really has, I would say, a holistic approach when it comes to inclusion, the building blocks. So everything from high quality digital education content, to connectivity, to ensuring our teachers have the right pedagogical practices. So it's really a holistic approach to this. Before the summer, the Commission adopted a recommendation really on high quality and inclusive primary and secondary education, looking at it through the blended learning angle, given what we have experienced collectively through the pandemic, and really providing guidance to member states in terms of what works, what's the common vision, what's the way forward, and how can they essentially adapt their education systems to be more flexible. We have also recently launched a structured dialogue with member states, and this is a highly political exercise where we're looking at commitments that can be made from across different governments from member states, so education, but also research, connectivity, investment, what needs to be done collectively with the private sector, with civil society as well, to deliver on high quality education. And the structured dialogue will also lead into 2 recommendations that we foresee to be adopted by the Commission by the end of next year. One is on the enabling factors for digital education. So how do we deliver on a high performing digital education ecosystem? What needs to be done? So that will be adopted indeed by the end of next year. And the second council recommendation we have is really on improving, I would say, the provision of digital skills through education and training. So how can we strengthen the skills of our learners? How can we enrich their learning experience? How do we look at the professional development of teachers? What stuff needs to be put in place to really strengthen that acquisition of skills? And lastly, we've already talked a little bit about EU funding, InvestEU, the structural funds that were coming up from the Recovery and Resilience funds, but also looking at the available support that we have through EU funding, everything from intranet access to purchasing digital equipment, e-learning applications, and ensure that within the action plan, there's a room there for investment through those funds. And the last, I would say, is an area that we are, I would say, in the early phases, but promising work. And that's cooperation with the European so educational technology ed tech sector. This is key, given their work looking at the use of technology in classroom, looking at cooperating with them, looking at how their I would say expertise on the tech side can allow for learning that is adaptive, assistive, inclusive. So that is an ongoing dialogue. And our Commissioner Gabrielle, has started a set of roundtable discussions with representatives of the European EdTech sector, and looking at how we can closely cooperate moving forward. And my last slide is, obviously we're always learning and we're continuing to learn. A little bit of promo here. In October, we released a study, Enhancing Learning Through Digital Tools and Practices. And here we're looking at really the use of tech in education and how it can promote inclusion across different groups of learners. So that would be it. I was 17 minutes, a little over the 12 minutes I was allotted. So that was as brief as I could be. And I know a previous speaker from the unit I'm in actually presented the Digital Education Action Plan, I think in October. So I tried not to repeat in too much detail what was said already, as I know some of some of the audience watching today. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Marta, for your clear and rich presentation. I just want to mention that the presentation you were referring to in the conference in Brussels, the recording of that presentation is available on the EASPD website, or it is not? No, Rachel? Okay, but the presentation is available.
The presentation is available, yeah.
So it's really interesting to look on the EASPD website and to look at the presentation, because it's slightly different from this one, which was also very interesting. Thanks for that, Marta. It's very nice to get a look on the data you have gathered across Europe about this impact of the COVID pandemic on digital education, and especially to learn the response from the European Commission in the Digital Education Plan. We are very curious about the European Digital Education Hub that you will launch. It will be a very interesting digital place for teachers and policymakers to share their experience and to express their needs towards the European Commission and towards each other. I have one question in the Q&A, and that's a really specific one, Marta, for you. The question is, what are need competencies? Can you explain that, please?
Need competences, digital need.
N-E-E-T.
Oh, need. So no, sorry, needs. So
Needs.
it's
Okay.
so students or citizens need their education, employment, or training. So here we're looking at essentially citizens that, as I said, are not in education, not in formal education, not employment, and not in training. So in terms of seeing what we can provide them, what are their digital needs, how can we help them strengthen their digital skills and their digital competences. But that's what the needs through informal learning, through learning that takes place outside of classrooms, through their participation in projects, through volunteering, through internships, through the work we do with the European Solidarity Corps, Erasmus Plus, obviously. So it's a way that, you know, to bring in those people who currently aren't taking part into the digital dimension and kind of breaking down the digital divide that way.
Okay, thanks for the clarification. I don't see any other questions in the Q&A or in the chat. I would like to invite the participants, if you do have questions, please write them down in the Q&A or in the chat. But now I would like to give the floor to Gerald Craddock from the Center for Excellence in Universal Design. You will speak and talk about the progression of universal design and universal design for learning in Ireland, and how it aligns with the Lisbon Declaration, as well as touching on the Commission's Digital Education Action Plan. Thank you very much, Gerald, for sharing your screen. I will give the floor to you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the opportunity to speak this morning. People can see the screen?
Yep, all good.
Very good. So a very brash title I'm putting up this morning: Applying Universal Design Systematically Creates an Inclusive Learning Environment for All. So very much in line with both the Salzburg Declaration from EASPD, but also the latest declaration from the Lisbon Declaration, which kind of summarized kind of 3 key points. The economic, which I think was also mentioned by the previous speaker. How do we move from this segregated to mainstream education? The whole area of training, and we would see, and the centre I head up in Ireland, which is a government-led centre on applying universal design across the board. And of course, we need to reform the education system, particularly, and I think it was raised particularly in the digital education plan, is around flexibility in assessment. I think is critical moving forward. So the centre is based in the National Disability Authority, and because we're celebrating International Day of Persons with Disabilities in Ireland, we try and get as many public buildings in purple. So this is our building last year, celebrating the 3rd of December, International Day of Persons with Disabilities. So I'm not quite sure if that's a European thing, but definitely we're getting to see more and more countries setting their buildings lit up in purple for International Day of Persons with Disabilities. So our centre that I head up, we look at 3 core areas: built environment, services and products. And we see services, education very much under that heading, and information communication technologies, and how they interact and converge and work together. All our materials are available freely on universaldesign.ie. And just for people, a simple cartoon on what is universal design. And it is a caretaker shoveling snow off the steps of a school, and the child in the wheelchair says, can you not clear the ramp? And the caretaker says, well, no, let me clear the steps first. And the kid says, well, if you cleared the ramp, we can all get in together. So very much about inclusion. How do we all benefit from education, and that we can access it and participate fully in education. And I suppose the World Disability Report talks about that shift from accessible design, talking about very much basic access and usability, particularly focused on persons with disabilities, where universal design puts it into a whole different context, talks about enables independent social participation and for all, including persons with disabilities, and it is about constant improvement. And I think Rachel mentioned that in her slide around that. So when we talk about systems, and this is research we did a couple of years ago looking at the whole school campus environment, and the research came up with kind of I suppose an ecosystem perspective, looking at it from a macro, meso and micro. So the macro is at a national level, European level, the meso very much at the organization level, and micro very much within the classroom, within the school, the teacher, student interaction. And it is all about creating, I think back to Rachel's point, creating that community, that the school is very much central. Like if you look at any community, the school is central to that community. And how do we promote that more? And we kind of see it at that systems ecosystem level in the work that we do. So again, this is just another representation looking at the macro, the meso, the micro, down to the learner. And some of the key elements from policies and again, strategies such as the EASPD, such as the European Commission on their digital plan at a macro level. Then at the meso level is how do we get this into organizations? And then very much the practitioner level, how do we get this down into the micro level within the classroom? Designing our curricula, designing our classrooms, the environment to support all learners. So just, I suppose just a one that I've come across recently with the World Economic Forum, their intelligence unit. I've actually now seen universal inclusive design as one of the transformative agents for a more equitable society. And just highlighting two elements, but probably three: technology access and inclusion, which is very much previous speaker was talking about, inclusive education design, but also the number 5, talking about sustainable community design. So we talk about sustainability. Two that we would concentrate on in our work. And we see universal design kind of core to the 3 key pillars of sustainability: social, ecological, and economic. And then I suppose one of the interesting things, the European Commission on the strategy for disabilities 2021-2030 talks about the whole intersectional perspective. And I think that's an important element, and it's definitely a new word in the last couple of years that we've come across, is that connection. When we talk about an individual, it can be gender, racial, ethnic, sexual, religious, disability is very much part of that. And the Commission see a key way progressing this strategy is through universal design. and it incorporated into all actions. So just the work we've been doing at a national level. SOLACE is the state agency tasked with building world-class further education training sector to fuel Ireland's future. So that's their mission statement. Would be the key government agency on vocational education in Ireland, and significant work that we've done with them over the last, I suppose, 5 to 6 years has been integrating universal design both into their strategy that they just launched earlier this year, but also just in September, their Adult Literacy for Life 10-year strategy. And core to that was universal design, that they looked at it across 4 key areas. So making sure that the access was very personalized for the learner around registration. The technology, as already mentioned, is accessible. And I suppose websites being, I suppose, an important element, and particularly now with the Web Accessibility Directive, that all public websites, including educational websites, need to be fully accessible, as in of 2020, as in last year, and of June of this year, that all public mobile apps have to be fully accessible. So that is important. New, as I think also mentioned by Rachel, was the whole area of data collection. So we've been tasked now as the National Monitoring Centre for Ireland around the web accessibility and mobile app accessibility. And we have to have our first report in to the Commission by the 23rd of December, which is less than a month away. Buildings, of course, very important, the accessibility of buildings, but also then the whole background and the backup services to meet the needs, such as the library, maintenance of buildings, etc., being very important. So quite a landmark document in Ireland, but also for the work of the centre to actually, I suppose, influence over the last number of years on getting our government departments in education embracing universal design. Another key deliverable as part of this strategy is universal design for further education practitioners, again, freely available. And we worked very closely with SOLACE on producing this guidance with a whole range of other stakeholders on how to apply universal design for learning within further education sector. And then there's just one example from a poster highlighting how to apply universal design for learning in further education. So it lowers perceived and actual barriers for a wide range of further education learners, enhance learning motivation and engagement, addressing more learning needs through learning design and focusing on learner strengths, which is very important. I think when we talk about disability, we have a propensity to concentrate on the negatives, what are the issues, rather than what are the actual strengths, and more flexibility in provision and reduction in the need for individual accommodation. So if you apply universal design at the start, less personal individual accommodations are required further down the stream. So on that note, I will finish. Thank you for the opportunity, and further information available on our universaldesign.ie site.
Thank you very much, Gerald, for sharing your experience and also your plans you have in Ireland for universal design and universal design for learning, especially towards the field of digital education and the new challenges we are faced. Also, thanks for the reflection on the Lisbon Declaration. I also learned a new word or a new abbreviation, FET, Further Education and Training. I will remember that. We also have a very specific question for you in the Q&A. And the question is, what does the term champions on the micro level stands for? Can you explain that, please?
Yeah, so champions is, I suppose, in case of education, we're looking at educators who are champions on inclusive education. So
Okay.
looking at champions at the meso, but also at the macro level. So with policymakers who are leaders, and EASPD would be in that category as champions on inclusive education.
Thank you very much. So our teachers are the champions and we need them at all levels, I suppose.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. One other question. It's a long one. It's so interesting to discuss universal design and improving digital competencies. But what to do if there is a little political will to have inclusive education in a member state? Where a headmaster of special schools say in discussions on inclusion that we need to have separate schools for persons with disabilities because society is demanding. How is this in Ireland? Is the universal design supported and driven by the state?
Yeah, a long question. Yeah, and a long history. Yeah, I suppose answering the last part first. Yes, we're beginning to get traction on applying universal design, and I suppose when the centre was set up in 2007, there was little understanding what was universal design or what is universal design, and a lot of people saw it as, well, that's just another name for accessible design or just around disability. So as you can see from the example, you know, they were 14, 15 years later, and we're now beginning to see traction with one of the lead state education bodies, Solace, on taking that on board. So it does take time, perseverance, I think, persistence, but also case studies and quality examples. And I suppose looking at Commission and this new education hub they're setting up, I think that could be another catalyst for other states to take on board more inclusive practices. So yeah, it's a journey. I've been at this for 30 odd years. So yeah, and Ireland would have been in that similar state when I started in this area in a special school 37 years ago. That it was very much special education in a parallel universe to mainstream education, and that has been a journey, and we're still on that journey in Ireland.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't want to go too much in detail, but it's important also to give your thought on the first question, the specific situation where a headmaster of special schools say in discussion that, yeah, we need these separate schools because society is not ready, is demanding that. How would you react to that question?
Yeah, I would say that's where I started 35 years ago in education, that it was very much special schools felt, and also parents felt, and I still see that in Ireland, where parents feel that their children will get the supports in special education rather than going into mainstream education. And again, in the Lisbon Declaration document, where the rightly points out where this may happen in primary school, where they may be in mainstream primary, but when it comes to second level, that they end up moving into special education. So yeah, it's not an easy answer. Yeah, there's lots of stakeholders, and I would have seen it with parents that I would have dealt with when I was frontline worker myself, where they felt that going to a special school gave more opportunities for their child. And again, without the supports in mainstream, which again is a key part of the Lisbon Declaration, supports and resources need to be made in mainstream schools so that parents will vote with their feet and support their kids moving into mainstream education.
Okay, thanks for that. Do you still have special schools in Ireland?
Yes, we do, yeah.
You do.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's still a journey and it's still a
Yeah.
challenge also in
Yeah.
Ireland.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for sharing your experiences. I would now like to move on to Helen Portal from Inclusion Europe. She will give feedback also on the Lisbon Declaration and will highlight the experiences of persons with disability on the impact of the COVID pandemic on inclusive education. And we hope that you also will provide some recommendations for the European Commission. Helen, please, the floor is yours.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation and for the great previous presentations. So first, I wanted to really congratulate EASPD on their Lisbon Declaration, because I think it captures very well the situation and the still existing barriers when it comes to inclusive education, and specifically, for example, the funding of segregated school that continues, the barriers to accessibility, and all the misconceptions that still exist and so on. So I won't repeat everything because Rachel gave us a very good presentation, but this declaration gives concrete recommendations on how to adapt systems to learner to the many stakeholders that exist in the education sector when it comes to designing and implementing inclusive education. So this is very important, and it also comes at a time where us at Inclusion Europe, where we represent people with intellectual disabilities and their families, have released our position paper on education. And in this position paper, we repeat also the need and our beliefs on why it's so important for learners with intellectual disability to be in mainstream schools, and including children with complex support needs. We also believe, and I'm very happy that it was explained before, the importance of education throughout all life and at all stages of life. And also what we had in this paper is the importance of being part of the education system. So the possibility of being teachers or researcher at the university when you have a disability, including an intellectual disability. And this declaration also gives an updated vision and explanation of what inclusive education looks like, taking into account all the lessons learned and new changes that happened during the COVID-19 pandemic and following school closures and the increased use of technologies. So it's been actually quite a while that we've been in this digital age and era, but as it was said also before, the COVID-19 pandemic had quite an impact on education for everyone. It was, I think, difficult for everyone to adapt, for children, for learners with and without disability. But because it was already very difficult for children with disability to have access to education and mainstream education, well, the COVID-19 showed that it was even more difficult for them to follow when there was an emergency situation. And as we often say at Inclusion Europe, that the COVID-19 did not bring any new problem, it only exacerbated the ones existing. So children with disabilities had difficulties accessing inclusive education, and this happened again in the emergency situation. And often when we design something, it's not inclusive from the beginning. So that's why universal design and universal design for learning is very important. And we had a very good presentation just before on this. But in many cases, people with disabilities are not taken into account from the beginning. And this was also the case when designing schooling solutions for children in the COVID period. And we gathered with our members, from our members in the different European countries, some information and problems they had when it came to education. And what some of our members said is that it was very difficult because, well, first, as for many other people, some did not have access to technology, some did not have the necessary material, internet connection, and so on. Then it was difficult for the parents to support children, and especially children with disabilities who need extra support and sometimes support 24 hours a day and 7 days a week. So this was one of the situations. In some of the cases also, children with disability have access to therapy when they go to school or some medical support. And when school closed, those therapies stopped as well. So this was a problem during the COVID. And yeah, those were the main difficulties people with disabilities experienced. And yeah, professionals warned that it could have dramatic consequences on the development of children with intellectual disabilities, and especially when it's believed that they are already sometimes behind when it comes to education compared to children without disabilities. Well, if they are the last one being thought of when it comes to making school accessible in times of COVID, then it creates more children being left behind. And this is why we had this previous conversation before the meeting started, when some of you said schools were closing again. I hope it won't be too long, because it was already very difficult for children with disability to follow during this COVID period. So I really hope it won't happen again. And so for the recommendation to ensure that the European Commission's Digital Education Action Plan is inclusive, well, first of all, it's great that the Commission came up with such an action plan, because it's been, as I said, a number of years that we entered this digital age, and the pandemic really accelerated the use of technologies in school. And we also have numbers of projects that show that the use of information and communication technology can be a great asset in the development and education of children with disabilities. So those projects exist. I would say that there's no reason to be afraid of technologies, and they should be welcomed in the education. But of course, it should not replace teachers and not replace school happening in person, and make sure that this COVID situation where online education, it is temporary and it doesn't become on the long term, because education has also very because being in class with other students without disabilities and with disabilities is very important for everyone, and this is we saw that on children with disabilities, it had a very negative impact, the fact that they were not able to see other friends without disabilities during the COVID period on their development. So this is something that's really important. And yes, so those technologies could be used to really make sure children are included. What I would warn also is that technologies should be inclusive of children with disability, but they should also not be used, for example, during an activity to make sure that children with disabilities are busy with their computer or on something like this when they cannot participate to other activities. So make sure that everyone has access to technology the same amount, and that it's not a way of creating segregated activities in the classroom, for example. So this is something I would warn against. And otherwise, yeah, of course, but I think that the Commission did well in this and explained that they had lots of consultation, and this hub could also be one place to do so. Consultation with people with disabilities and their representative organization when it comes to designing accessible activities is very important. And I would also say that this is important when it comes also to collaborating with tech actors and businesses to design accessible technologies. So that's
Okay, thank you very much, Helen, also for your very nice testimony from Inclusion Europe. Is it possible to share your position paper you mentioned? Maybe you can
yes, of course.
Okay, that would be very nice, so we can read it. There is no specific question for you yet in the Q&A, but I do have a question for you. I think it's really important that you stress that a consultation with people with disabilities is very, very important in the future. Also in the Digital Education Action Plan and the hub they are setting up with everyone. You also mentioned that there was a negative impact on the development of children with intellectual disabilities of all ages. And when the schools were closed, that they also lacked their access to therapy and medical support. Unfortunately, we are now in the 4th wave of the pandemic, and in many countries, also in Belgium, schools are closed again, or schools think about it to close again. Do you have specific recommendations for them or lessons learned that you want to share now?
Yeah, well, I think that all the lessons learned from the previous waves should be taken into account when it comes to this, to school closure again. I think that now, so as you said, it's the 4th wave, or I'm losing track of the number of waves, but I think because it's not the first time, probably this time schools will be a bit more organized, and various actors in supporting children could be more prepared for this. I think it's important that if there are alternative therapies and so on, that they continue. Now that we still have access to vaccination and so on, if it can still happen. What we had was also experience from some of our members who explained that in places where it was possible, for instance, in towns where there were a few schools, they kept one of the school open, and they pulled all the resources, support resources and teachers to make sure that education could continue in school. So that's also, it's a bit of a relief for parents. So yeah, I would suggest making sure all those lessons from the previous waves are taken into account, and make sure children with disabilities are thought of from the beginning.
Okay, thank you very much. We will certainly take that into account. Also, you mentioned that we welcome technology, but technology can never replace teachers. It's a really nice one, and also technology should be inclusive, but be sure that everyone has access to this technology, and it may not be used as an excuse for segregated activities. That's also a very, very important one. Thank you very much. Now I would like to give the floor to Archa Krauchenberg from the European Parents Association. We are really glad that you are here with us, and we would really like to know your experiences as a parent, and also from the Parents Association on the effect of the pandemic in the teaching and learning. And also we are very curious about your feedback on the Lisbon Declaration and the Digital Education Plan from the European Commission. Archa, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation, and I'm very honored to be here in this very illustrious circle of experts. Now, I'm not an expert at all. I want to say that right from the very start. I represent the European Parents Association. I've been active in parental involvement and in parental representation for more than 20 years, but I'm not a specialist on persons with disability. That said, I am myself a person with disability, and I have a son who has a visual impairment, and I have a daughter who is a teacher in a special in a school for children with special needs. So this is probably why our association decided that I would best represent the association in this panel, because I do have at least some personal experience. Now I would try to share my screen, and I hope that works. Yes, and we're back to the problem with the full screen. Let me see what I can do that. Yes, there we go. So I don't know whether everybody knows the European Parents Association, so I will just briefly say a few words about us. We are, in geographical wise, we are a very big organization because we have members from all over Europe, and there are more than 35 members in 24 countries. And they represent national and regional parents associations. We also have some single local parents association, but they can only be an associate member. Our 7 board members come from 7 different countries, so we really represent the width and the breadth of parental representation in Europe. Our 2 main objectives are, on the one hand, parental representation on the European level, and we really try to represent all parents from all different kinds of schools and all different kinds of backgrounds. European level means the European Commission, the Parliament, and all sorts of other European institutions. It also means participation in EU projects and taking part in workshops, working groups, and conferences. And of course, the second one is fostering exchange among our members, sharing good practices. We have 2 general assemblies per year where we do that. Our core paradigms, well, one of them, the most important for us, is that parents are recognized as the primary educators of their children. But you can also see here that we base our work on the Convention of the Right of the Child, so also a UN convention, just like EASPD. And we also say that parents need encouragement and support. We're firmly convinced that nobody falls from heaven as a born parent, and that it is something you learn. So very often you learn by doing, and that people need to be supported in this very difficult task. I mean, I often say it's one of the most difficult jobs in the world, and nobody ever gives you training. That would never happen with any other job that you can probably think of. When we say first, then we don't only mean chronologically, but we also mean the most impacting. And we plead for not blaming parents who really try to do their best for their children, that they do so, but we would like all parents to be enabled and empowered to support their children in the best possible way. So this is how we work with our 2 general assemblies every year. Now with the pandemic, we've also taken to do webinars and connect with our members in this way. So the digital age has also entered the parental representation. We found that a good way on the one hand, because we can reach many more people with webinars that usually cannot come to our general assemblies and conferences. But on the other hand, as has already been mentioned, I mean, it lacks the human contact. And we just had 2 weeks ago our last General Assembly in Vilnius. And I mean, people were so happy to be able to exchange in person again after 2 years. So this really, really, really makes a difference in human relations. Now, when we talk about the effect of COVID on the teaching and learning, I mean, we all agree that that was pretty much an overnight change to online schooling. And we found a big diversity, to name it in a polite way, between countries, but also within countries and different types of schools. So when you talk, for instance, about primary schools, they in general were totally unprepared and did not have any means for online teaching and learning. It was really the teachers' initiative that everything depended on whether a proper schooling in some way could go on. Some schools just had work packages that the parents needed to pick up at school on Monday morning and bring them back on Friday, and maybe there would be a telephone call by the teacher in the middle of the week saying, how are you doing? So that was pretty much on the parents, and I will give you in a minute, I will give you the voices of parents on that how this went. In very general, we can say that schools that had been applying digital technology before the COVID were much better off. They had better possibilities. They had learning platforms. Students were in general better equipped and knew also how to deal with those devices. So there's there were huge discrepancies. And as I said, not only between countries, so in very general, I don't like these generalities, but you can say that the countries in the north were a bit better off than the countries in the south. But of course, if you look at single schools, there might be big differences also there within the countries. And I think that digitalization had been around before, but had not taken full grasp in the education systems, actually well, maybe apart from Estonia, but in none of the other countries. So what were the parents' comments? So I have given you here the positive ones and the negative ones, and try to sort of balance this. Parents appreciated the big step forward in digitalization of the schools. They had in many cases already been pleading for that for a long time, so they finally saw that happen. They also said that students learn to better self-organize through this online teaching and learning, that they had more possibilities to review content because things were online. They could look at things more often and were not dependent on the one presentation by the teacher. So they found quite a number of advantages, if you like, but of course also depending on whether the school had been well equipped or not. What parents criticized was that was a totally unstructured change to, of course, naturally, I mean, this was an overnight change. So the schools that had no provision before, really struggled. And many teachers just grabbed some kind of communication channel, something they maybe already had before, a WhatsApp group they had with their students, a learning platform they had, but that means that in the same school, in the same class, different teachers use different platforms, different communication channels. Somebody sent homework by email, somebody announced it per WhatsApp, the other one in a Facebook group, and so on and so forth. So parents really struggled also to keep track, to say, oh, where is the teaching happening, who is asking what of the child and when. And in general, teachers were very much afraid that students will fall behind, so they tended to give out too many tasks without having any idea what the other teachers were doing. So there was a big confusion, especially during the first lockdown. And everybody relied on the parents to pull this through. Yeah. So there were lots of lessons learned. I think in the second lockdown, things worked already a bit better. Many schools had to decide on one platform that everybody used and so on. But still, there was a lot of weight on the parents' shoulders. Now, if we talk about parents of children with special needs, we also have this divide between positive and negative, of course. Many parents had been using digital tools to help their children to develop, and they were happy to see that finally the schools would pick up. And that, and in the end, online schooling for their children was not such a bad thing, because there were lots of advantages for the children. Yeah? They're hoping that this digitalization will finally allow for better participation of their children. Yeah? But of course, you also had the other voices, like my child will be left behind, my child will be excluded because there will be things going on that he or she cannot do or that we cannot provide. And there are concerns that overlap. Yeah, many parents would say, I can't help my children with these digital tasks because I don't know how to do this. We haven't got enough devices at home. My bandwidth, yeah, the infrastructure will not hold out. And that came from families where you would not actually expect that. I mean, the comment of we haven't got enough devices also came from families that you would probably categorize as very middle class and well-to-do families. But there was no necessity before the crisis to have 4 computers. Yeah, so there might have been one family computer and then a tablet. Yeah, but all of a sudden there were 2 parents teleworking and 2 children who had to have online courses, and then the 2 devices were simply not enough. Yeah, so these were the parents who desperately then ordered devices on the Amazon or whatever the big platforms are. But still, I mean, there were people struggling that you would not have expected it. And then on the other hand, of course, if you did not have the financial resources to do that, in some countries, the schools provided devices, especially to the children who did not have it. But we also had, especially in the first round, as I said, we had children who did everything on their mobile phone. Yeah? And astonishingly, there were children who did very, very well, even though it was only on mother's smartphone. Yeah? So it was a very tricky period, and as you may guess from my background, I'm Austrian, even though I'm not in Austria at the moment, but we are in our 4th lockdown, and we have fought like hell for a whole week to keep the schools open. So I can totally identify with what Helen said. I mean, it's bad for all children, specifically, of course, for children who already have whatever kind of issue it is. Yeah. So we've really tried to convince people. Fortunately, in Austria, I must say, we always had the minister on our side. He never wanted to close the school, not even in the first lockdown. He was overruled by the government then. This time he, I think, I mean, this is off record, I would say, we believe that he threatened the government with stepping down, so nobody wanted that. So they did keep the schools open, but they send a very, very ambiguous message to parents, because the regional governors that have a lot to say in our country, because we are a federal republic, would say to the parents, well, if you can, you keep your children home. And the minister said, no, 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 the schools are open, send your children. So that was not easy. In the weekend that preceded the lockdown, journalists went out to interview children. And the interesting thing was not on any of the TV channels, not one journalist could find one child who wanted to stay home. All the children wanted to go to school. And I think that's a very decisive indication. Yeah, children, not only for the academic learning, but we know that schools are a place of social learning that is so much more important than any formula in physics or math or whatever that you can probably learn sometime later. But it's a place of social learning. So try to keep the schools open, make them safe places. I mean, in Austria, we have not been bad at that. I don't want to pride myself too much about that, but we have been testing children in school 3 times a week. And with these tests, we sort of catch eventual COVID cases really at the beginning, and we have no clusters in school. Yeah? So sometimes there's a child that tests positive, and that child is sent home immediately to do a PCR and then to check whether this is a real positive test. But we've been able to avoid clusters in schools, and I think that's a very important point, so that parents can also feel safe when they send their children there. But I think it's absolutely out of the question that we continue closing schools. This cannot be. When it comes to technology and including technology in schools, you're probably all aware with Stephen Hawking, who always saw himself first and foremost as a physicist, a cosmologist, a mathematician, and only very last as a person with a disability. But of course, he suffered from a very, very severe sclerosis, and that caused him to be totally paralyzed at the end of his life. But I think he's also a good example of how technology can help. Yeah, because as his illness was moving forward, new ways had to be found how to communicate with him. And every time his state of health deteriorated, they came up with new possibilities to make him communicate. And he was diagnosed with this disease back in the 1960s. He was told he had only 2 years to live. In the end, he became over 70 years old, and he wrote a number of absolutely breathtaking and milestone-setting books, and was really one of the most known and most renowned scientists of the 20th and 21st century. So I think this is a great example of what technology can do, how it can help. Especially people with disabilities, and I think that of course we need the specific training also for teachers in school and so on, but there is enormous potential, and we will come to the frameworks in a minute. That is not always reflected there. So yes, we still have a long way to go. It has already been mentioned today that we need a mind shift in society that is then transferable to education, or maybe we need to first transfer education and then make the shift in society. I think it works a bit both ways. So it's a kind of circle that feeds each other, and the steps that we take in education will eventually influence society, and everything that we do in society will eventually influence education. So I think we have to work on all levels in order to make this really happen. Yeah. I think one of the big problems is that there needs to be more information, that people just don't know. What kinds of disabilities are out there, how you can deal with them in the community, but especially also in school. And of course, and I think that has been said also today, we need better training for teachers. There's no way around that. when we talk about the frameworks, I mean, we have this incoming digital competencies framework 2.2. That is an overhaul, if you like, of the one 2.0 that has 5 key areas and 21 competencies. If you look at those very closely, they are very universal. They're made for everyone. And they have no specific provisions for people with disabilities. Yeah? So there's, so on the one hand, you can say universal design. On the other hand, I'm a bit afraid that at the stage at which we are now, if we don't mention what needs to happen also for people with disabilities, I'm a bit afraid that this will, as with many transversal things, yeah, I also see that in schools with other things like health literacy. If it's a transversal matter, nobody feels really responsible for it, then there is no money allocated to it. And then things tend to either fall completely flat or to be on the shoulders of the very few, very engaged people. And I don't think that should be the case. Yeah? If we talk about transversal, everybody should be aware of it and everybody should be implementing. And one thing I've learned in my long career as a parental representative, the paper is very patient. You can write a lot of things, but then I'm a bit always afraid when it comes to implementation that things do not happen. Yeah. In the new DigComp framework, what we see there, and we had a talk about that yesterday at the Lifelong Learning Week with people who were involved in the development of that new framework. They were talking about striking a digital balance, also with a non-use option, not to rely too much on digital, and also to teach people how to acquire digital skills without digital devices, which I think is very important, because you cannot be, or you should not be on the screen all day long. What was not in the DigComp before were the addictive behaviors that we know are a big problem. Yeah, they only talk about cyberbullying and grooming there, and that's definitely not enough. We need screen guidelines for children, definitely. And the risk of increasing health inequalities for vulnerable groups. Yeah? So digital well-being factors are now going to be introduced in this new version. And as parents, we're very happy about that. It's not enough yet. And I think if we talk about digital well-being of people with disabilities, I think we really need to watch out what is happening there. What we also see in the new
Archa, could I please ask you to wrap up,
yes,
because we will still want some time
yes,
for questions. Thank you.
Exactly. I've this and another slide. So computational thinking, binary code, and analog learning as an option that is in this new version. So hopefully that will take its effect also in the implementation. When we come to the Lisbon Declaration that has been elaborated by EASPD, we agree with all the points that are mentioned in there, obviously. We always plead for better involvement of parents and families when things are established. And I think that has been mentioned already by other speakers today, that we need to listen to the voices of people with disabilities and to their parents and families, and bring that into whatever we create as new laws, frameworks, and decrees that will be implemented in different countries. And we also need more flexibility on the labor market for the families, in order to be able to create their time for being with their children and giving them the support they need, but also for including people with disabilities in the labor market. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arja. You're very clear about the work of the European Parents Association, also about the core paradigms. You made quite a few strong statements. I appreciate that about stop closing the schools, because they're also a place of social learning, not only academic learning. I wonder if we can also make digital learning a place of social learning, and that might be a question for the other panelists. Thank you very much for your introduction and for your words. I would now like to give the floor to the other panelists to comment on each other's presentation, to ask questions. But first of all, we also have a large question in the Q&A for Ms. Marta Markowska. Question is, to what extent could general digital systems as Microsoft Office could become more accessible and more supportive for foreign language learners? How can the features of special digital tools, such as dyslexia software, be integrated in general digital systems? Is there a role for the European Commission in this? Marta, please.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I think that's a relevant question. If we look at assistive and adaptive technologies, I think there's quite a bit of way to go in view of, what we at the Commission can do into ensuring that this is somehow incorporated into the learning offer in formal education. One of the two work streams that we have on this, one is the enabling factors, the political structure dialogue that we are now implementing on how to create this, high quality digital education ecosystem. And one of the enabling factors, if you look in the Digital Education Action Plan, is actually on assistive and adaptive technologies. So it's something that we'll be looking towards looking in terms of the guidance that we will provide to member states and onwards on how this, on raising the awareness around this, but also practically speaking, how it can be implemented. The second work stream is obviously the ongoing dialogue we have with the EdTech sector, looking at closer cooperation, innovation in digital education, and how we can bring technology and its various aspects to promote inclusive learning. I mean, on the specifics of Microsoft or other companies, I'm not really in a position to comment on how they design their tools, but it's definitely important that we keep this in mind when we look at the bigger picture of technology and providing customized learning experience for all learners, definitely.
Okay, thank you. Archa, you mentioned the digital competencies. You are worried about the fact that they are maybe too universal, and that there is no specific recommendations for people with disabilities. I would like to ask to Gerald, what's your opinion about this? Is there a danger in this, or is this a good basic for being universal in the digital competences we need for the future?
There can be, if people don't understand what universal design is. So it is about, and I think EASPD cover it well, and I think the speaker as well talked about involving parents. So the whole thing about co-production, co-design, universal design, it is about involving all the stakeholders. So if that is a core value on engaging with all stakeholders, then you can design a system that is inclusive. But if not, if stakeholders are not part of that process, such as parents, families, persons with disabilities, are now under Common 7 of the Uncrpd, which talks about disabled persons organizations being a core part of any consultation. Then, yeah, if people are not at the table, then yeah, you're designing something not for your whole community. I suppose just on the other point, just on the technology there, I think a very important standard which has been harmonized across Europe is the ICT. It's given as an official title, it's the EN 301549, which is the accessibility requirements for public procurement of ICT products and services in Europe. Now, that's a harmonized European standard, which when you talk about harmonize, it means it is now a requirement for all public bodies, governments, to be purchasing products that are fully accessible. This is equivalent to the 508 from America, which transformed the accessibility of ICT products from the early 90s in America. So that, and both the 508 and the ICT 501, 549 are compatible, so that it's one that we're pushing very much with our own national government, that any products, which immediately pushes this back, because the biggest funder or procurer in any country is the government. So
okay, thank you. Is there also a role for the European Commission? Will the European Digital Education Hub involve in an active way the stakeholders from people with disabilities? Maybe Marta, you can answer this question.
I mean, thank you very much for that question. I mean, the role of the Education Hub is really to bring in as many voices, as many themes, as many issues that we think are of political relevance and require discussion across Europe. So naturally, there will be a role there to look at inclusion and learners with disabilities, in addition to a lot of the other themes that are of importance, pedagogy, investment, teacher training, and onwards. This is, I would say, an initiative that is still in the early development phase. It will be implemented progressively throughout early 2022 onwards. And then I think at that point, we might be able to tell a little more details in terms, but obviously we can't talk about digital education without the inclusion aspect. So that's what I can share at this point.
Okay, thank you very much. Helen, in the meanwhile, you have posted the Inclusion Europe's position paper on inclusion in the chat, so people can click on the link so you can have it. Do you would like to give any comments on the previous answers and questions?
No, I don't have any comments. I think the answers were great in what they said, but it's good to know that inclusive perspective will be taken into account in this hub. So,
okay, thank you very much. Then I would now like to close the panel and give the floor to the co-chair of the Member Forum Education, Miguel Valles, to summarize and close this this webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Annemie. Bom dia, good morning from Lisbon. It has been a wonderful panel, and it's such a privilege here to listen to all of you. Annemie and myself, we are co-chairs of education on the EASPD, and this is the result of also the conference in Lisbon on 2021 that we revised the Lisbon Declaration. Such an up-to-date document. While we were constructing it, we mentioning COVID as past. We had no idea that it would be such a present document, and so many schools will be struggling again, even this year and next year probably, with some closures and shutdowns. To all the panelists, it has been a privilege to listen to Marta Markowska and the importance of the digital education action plan. I think it's a document that we really need to study it. We haven't seen yet its application at the national level. We haven't seen it how it transforms into action, but it will soon be there. So it will be really important for everyone to study this and to push forward at the regional and national level this action plan to take shape and really come to ground and in a real time. Gerald Craig, it's always a pleasure to hear from you. The adaptation and now, even now that we see how the use of digital competencies are in need, and how can we motivate children through gamification, and even in higher levels. So now we are, for example, we have a project with a higher education level that is learning from gamification of education to keep their children, their students motivated and really to improve skills. Helen Portal, it's so important to hear from you. The impact that COVID had on all students, mainly and specifically the children with special needs. In Portugal, for example, we are witnessing while the beginning of the school year, we received children with on the second degree of school and even third degrees that struggle on reading and writing competencies, because they really didn't grasp the online teaching, so they could never attend the full school. So now, with the beginning of the new school year, schools are struggling with all the children and trying to recover all the competencies that were lost on this almost 2 years of two school years. Arja Krauchenberg, you're definitely an expert. We strongly believe, as a service provider, that parents are experts on their children. So we also always see parents as our guidance, as someone that knows their children much better than we do, and we as a service provider are there only to talk with parents and together decide and improve your knowledge and how we can upgrade it to a higher level. It is it was a pleasure to hear from all of you, and we strongly believe that an inclusive education is a better learning environment for all students. And this is what that head teacher that asked, my special school is better to attend children with disabilities. We have to prove him that it is proven that all children learn better together. And we have now enough data to prove to that headmaster that an inclusive setting really is a better learning environment. So I hope that I see you all soon in another webinar. It has been a pleasure, and I'll give the floor to Rachel.
Thank you very much. Just to say, to me, thank you very much to all of our speakers. Thank you very much to all of our participants. I'll be sending you an email after this with our declaration. And yeah, I hope that you can join us in supporting it. And as Miguel has said, to move forward together to create more inclusive education environments. So enjoy the rest of your day, and hopefully we'll see you in another webinar, or hopefully another event in person in 2022. So thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.